Before form, before time, before the experience of being someone with a name and a history, there was something else. Not a void, not a blankness, but a presence so complete it had no edge. A field of awareness, unfragmented and self-knowing. In Hermetic tradition, it is called Nous, the divine mind. Not a god in the image of man, not a ruler above the clouds, but the very origin of thought, of light, of life itself. Everything that ever would be was already held within it. This was not stillness from lack, but stillness from fullness. In this original state, there was no separation, no birth or death, no division of self and other. No beginning, no becoming, only being. Hermes, the seeker of wisdom, asked to understand the nature of reality. In response, he was met by Pumandres, the divine mind itself. It revealed the origins of all that exists, and what was shown to him was not a mechanical account of creation, but a vision, radiant, ordered alive. A vision in which creation begins with light, not the light of the sun, but something more essential, the first awareness, the first clarity, a brilliance that did not come from elsewhere but existed on its own terms. From this light came motion, not of objects but of intention, the movement of knowing itself. Light generated life, and together light and life gave rise to mind. This mind, being both aware and active, was the first to perceive. It looked upon itself and understood. It looked outward and conceived. And from that act of seeing, a second light came forth. This was not the mind itself, but what flowed from it. The word, the voice of becoming. The first gesture toward what would eventually become matter, soul, personhood. In that gesture, you were already present. Before you were an individual, before you had shape or name, you existed as part of this movement. You were not summoned later. You were not a byproduct of biology or chance. You were embedded from the start, as a possibility within the fabric of light, as a soul within the mind of God. The Hermetica tells us that the human soul was not born in the world, it came from something prior to it. The soul is not a product of the body, but a reflection of the divine. It is the result of the same act that called the heavens into order. There is something deeply reassuring in that. The soul was not formed in conflict, nor from scarcity, but in clarity. It came from unity, not from struggle, and because of this, it carries a memory, not always accessible but deeply embedded, a memory of being held in stillness before movement began. The divine mind created not just the structure of the cosmos, but also a higher form of human, not the physical body we inhabit now, but a being of pure vision and understanding. This original soul was not male or female. It had no need of opposites. It was whole, capable of knowing the all through direct perception, not through logic or experience. It saw the stars, the living order, the turning of the heavens. It witnessed the unfolding of creation and recognized that within all things was a mirror. It recognized its own likeness reflected in the cosmic dance. The soul did not feel alienated. It felt resonance. It saw and knew that what was expressed in form was not foreign, but familiar. And then something shifted. The soul, observing the beauty of the created world, felt drawn to it, not as a conquest, not from pride, but from recognition. The soul saw in form the possibility of expression. It saw the chance to not just reflect, but to participate, to step into the rhythm it had admired from a distance, to enter into experience. Hermetic texts describe this as a desire, not a base craving, but a sacred inclination. The soul desired to descend, to enter into embodiment, to know form from the inside, and in that desire, it turned from the stillness of pure being toward the unfolding of time. This was not a fall in the moral sense. It was not a punishment or a failure. It was a movement, intentional, alive, creative. The divine mind did not reject the soul for its desire. It allowed the descent, as if to say, go, learn, express what you are in the places where it is not yet remembered. And so the journey toward incarnation began. As the soul approached embodiment, it passed through the spheres, layers of the cosmos, each shaping a part of its being. The Hermetica describes these as levels of planetary influence, where the soul receives qualities: emotion, desire, limitation, fate. These are not burdens in themselves, they are conditions. They give the soul the context in which it will live and learn. But with each layer, something is dimmed, not taken away but covered. Like light passing through veils, the soul's awareness begins to soften. Memory thins. The sense of unity recedes, and by the time the soul reaches the threshold of birth, it has almost entirely forgotten where it came from. Still, the imprint remains. Even in its smallest moments, the soul carries that early knowing. It shows up as longing that has no name, as a quiet sense that this life, as it is, cannot be all there is, as a kind of ache that feels holy, even when it hurts. These are not signs of confusion. They are remnants, fragments of a memory too large for words. The soul enters the body, and the body becomes its instrument. Through sensation, through thought, through experience, it begins to navigate the world. It does not fully remember its source, but that forgetting is not permanent. It is the price of entering time. And even in forgetting, the soul is never truly lost. That which comes from light cannot be undone by shadow. That which was formed in unity cannot be broken by division. It can be obscured, but not destroyed. This is why certain moments in life seem to open something deeper than the mind, a sudden stillness in nature, a wordless joy in love, the awe that strikes us before beauty. These are not interruptions, these are echoes. Through them, something ancient within us stirs, something that knew peace before pain, wholeness before fear, presence before thought. The Hermetica reminds us, the one who knows themselves knows the all, not because the self contains all things, but because the true self is not separate from the all. To remember the soul's origin is to remember that we were never disconnected, only distracted. This is not a lesson to be learned once, it is a reality that unfolds in layers. Life becomes the slow uncovering of what was always there. A return not to something new, but to something original. The body changes, the world shifts. Thought comes and goes, but the core remains. The soul, as it was before embodiment, still exists beneath it all, not behind the scenes, but at the center of being. It waits not to be summoned, but to be listened to. The presence you were before birth is not far. It has not disappeared behind the veil of time. It is here, embedded in the stillness between moments. It does not speak in words, it reveals itself in silence. There is no technique to reach it, no ritual or philosophy more powerful than attention. To return to the soul's origin is not to travel backward, it is to deepen downward, into what has always been beneath the surface of things. Before you became someone, you were something far more fundamental. Not a blank slate, not an accident of biology, not an isolated consciousness waiting to be formed. You were an emanation of mind, a participant in light, a presence rooted in unity before it learned the language of division. And that origin is not just a chapter in your story, it is the ground beneath every step you take. Even now it holds you. And it will hold you still, long after name and form have dissolved. The soul had once rested in quiet brilliance, unbroken, untouched by time. Held in the stillness of the divine mind, it had known neither confusion nor sorrow. It was not seeking anything because it had not yet been divided from the all. But movement began, and with movement came difference, and with difference came experience. The soul, stirred by the beauty of becoming, turned toward embodiment. That turning was not sudden. It was a passage, a slow unfurling through invisible thresholds. In Hermetic understanding, the soul descends through the spheres, 7 layers of cosmic influence, each ruled by a celestial power. each imparting something essential and something binding. These spheres are not mechanical constructs, they are not places to be mapped, but states of vibration, atmospheres of being. The ancients knew them not as abstractions, but as living gates that shape every soul passing into time. Each soul, before it reaches the world, must move through them. And so, it begins. The first sphere is Saturn. Here the soul receives the seed of structure, limitation, discipline, the awareness of boundaries. What was once fluid now begins to take a more defined shape. Time becomes relevant. Space becomes measurable. The soul, once suspended in the eternal, feels the first weight of consequence. It is no longer everywhere at once. It must now move from one point to another. There is no cruelty in this, only the beginning of form. But structure is not neutral. It brings with it the first taste of forgetting. To be defined is to be distinct. To be distinct is to be apart. And so the soul's sense of unity begins to dim. The second sphere is Jupiter. Here the soul is infused with order, harmony, justice, the longing for balance. What Saturn shaped, Jupiter refines. The soul begins to carry within it the seed of law, not imposed from without, but felt from within. An inner compass is planted. But with this sense of order comes the awareness of chaos. The soul begins to understand that not all will be fair. It begins to anticipate a world in which balance must be restored, not assumed. Hope is born, and where hope exists, so too does uncertainty. Then comes Mars, the fire of intensity, of impulse, of force. The soul receives passion, not as mere emotion, but as a drive toward movement, toward action, toward challenge. Mars bestows courage, but also restlessness. A will to shape, to overcome, to assert. It is here the soul feels the first tremor of conflict, not yet against others, but within itself. It begins to sense that this world it is entering is not one of stillness, but of striving. And with this the soul's clarity dims further. The peace of the divine mind feels more distant now, not gone, but harder to reach. There is a new noise, inner, subtle, growing. From Mars, the soul enters the sphere of the sun. This is the center. Here the soul receives illumination, the capacity to know, to see, to recognize the true from the false. The sun offers light, not of memory, but of potential, an echo of the original radiance. But light casts shadows. Awareness now brings complexity. The soul begins to know itself as something in particular, not just as being in general. Individuality dawns, and with individuality, the soul must now ask, what am I for? What must I become? These questions are never fully answered in this world, but they follow us like a silent companion. The fifth sphere is Venus. Here the soul receives the capacity to feel beauty, to long for intimacy, to be drawn toward union, not the cosmic union it once knew, but personal embodied emotional closeness. This gift is gentle, but double-edged. It gives sweetness, connection, love, but it also brings longing, jealousy, fear of loss. The soul, once whole, now desires to be met, to be mirrored. It begins to search outward for what it once carried effortlessly within, and so the forgetfulness deepens. The sixth sphere is Mercury. Here the soul is given speech, thought, imagination, memory. It now holds the tools of communication, the ability to compare, to name, to categorize. This is an immense power. It enables civilization, relationship, understanding. But Mercury also scatters. It multiplies thoughts, it fragments attention. What was once a still, unified awareness becomes a stream of interpretations. Truth becomes harder to hear beneath the noise. The soul now has a voice, but it struggles to remember what it was meant to say. Finally, the soul passes through the sphere of the moon. Here the rhythms of growth, decay, emotion, and change are absorbed. the soul becomes bound to cycles: birth and death, waking and sleeping, rising and falling. In the lunar sphere, the soul receives its emotional body. It begins to feel, not as a total awareness, but as waves of reaction. It is here the veil is completed. The last thread of conscious memory is drawn over the soul's original state. And yet, something is preserved. The Hermetic text known as the Cup. We are told that before the soul fully descends, the divine offers it a gift, a final pouring. The Father of all sent forth the Word, who poured from this cup the mind to all souls who are ready to receive. This cup is not literal. It is the infusion of divine mind into the soul, an inner anchor. Even as the soul descends, even as it forgets, it carries a hidden link to the source. Those who drink deeply, says the text, awaken. They come to know themselves again. They remember. But many, distracted by the noise and allure of matter, forget to drink. They lose the thread. They take the surface for the whole. Still, the cup is given. The light is planted. Even in forgetting, the possibility of remembering remains. The soul, having received its attributes from the seven spheres and the pouring of the cup, now takes on the cloak of fate. It is shaped by what it has passed through, clothed in tendencies and tensions, yet never reduced to them. It is prepared to enter the world, not as a blank slate, but as a presence rich with latent knowledge, clouded by the veils of time. And so, it begins its descent into form, into matter, into limitation. From the outer stars through the breath of the heavens, into the delicate darkness of the womb, the descent is complete. In this state, the soul is silent. It waits. Its eyes have not yet opened, but the senses are forming. The pulse of time now moves around it. It is no longer floating in the eternal, it is waiting to be born. And though it has passed through forgetting, though the layers have thickened and the memory dimmed, it still carries that trace, that inner glimmer. This is what the Hermetica calls the mind within. The part of us that is not of this world, even as it moves through it. It is why, even as children, we ask questions that stretch beyond what we've been taught. Why we dream in symbols we never learned. Why we sense beauty in places no one pointed out to us. Something in us remembers. The soul now enters the body. The joining of spirit and flesh is complete. It is born into time, born into language, into culture, into story, born into forgetting. But the forgetting is not forever. There are moments, quiet, unguarded, when the veil thins, when the inner light stirs, when the divine mind that shaped us from the beginning whispers again through the noise, and though the voice is faint, it is there. The descent is not the end. It is another beginning of another path. Not back to where we started, but forward, toward a remembrance that includes everything we've touched along the way. The soul, having descended through the celestial gates and clothed itself in the subtle influences of the spheres, now rests within the body. The descent is complete. It has passed through time without time, clothed itself in traits, impulses, and tendencies. The form that will become you is in place. But the soul is not yet born into the world, not fully. There is a silence here, a pause, a moment before awakening into the stream of sensation. The Hermetica describes this condition as a kind of inner sleep, not unconsciousness, but a veiling. The light of the divine mind is still within, but it is dimmed. The voice of truth has not been silenced, only muffled beneath layers of experience not yet lived. The soul, before its first memory in this world, waits beneath the surface it cannot yet name. All that it once knew, its origin in the divine mind, its unity with all things, the light from which it came, now rests beneath the surface, wrapped in quiet, not lost, not destroyed, but hidden. This is the veil. It is not made of darkness or cruelty. It is not placed there by punishment or judgment. It is the necessary curtain between timeless being and the world of experience. To live within time, one must forget eternity. To move through form, one must first forget formlessness. To become someone, the soul must briefly set aside the memory of being everything. It is not that truth is gone, it is that truth becomes something the soul must remember, rather than something it simply is. Ignorance is the root of all earthly sorrow, says the Hermetica. For the soul, being divine, forgets its own nature and falls into the illusion that it is only what the senses tell it. The soul now begins to feel the first flickers of personality. The structure of the body begins to impress itself upon the inner world. Sensations rise, warmth, pressure, sound. The soul does not yet interpret them, but it registers them, faintly, as if in a dream. And in that dreaming, the soul begins to drift away from what it once knew so intimately. It starts to believe it is the body, that it begins with skin and ends with breath, that its value will be drawn from what it sees and what it gains. This forgetting is subtle. It does not arrive with an announcement. It settles in slowly, like fog on still water, and soon the light of the soul is mistaken for the flicker of the senses. The Hermetica calls this condition the state of illusion, when the immortal soul identifies with a temporary form, when it takes the changing to be true, when it no longer remembers what was known before time began. The soul forgets itself and believes it is mortal. It takes on the worries of the world, the desires of the body, the fears of loss and death. But even here, even under the weight of forgetting, something within the soul resists total sleep. There remains a tension. The soul feels, even if faintly, that something is missing. A kind of emptiness appears, not of meaning but of memory. A hunger that the world cannot satisfy, though the world will offer many things in its place. This hunger is sacred. It is the soul's own echo, its quiet call to itself. Even as it forgets, it leaves a trail behind, a thread of longing, a subtle resistance to full immersion in illusion. The Hermetica teaches that within each soul, the divine mind leaves a seed, a spark of itself that is never covered, never touched by decay. It does not force itself to awaken. It waits. In most, it remains dormant, buried beneath thought, emotion, sensation, identity. But it is never absent. And in certain moments of stillness, grief, or unexpected beauty, it begins to stir. The soul does not recognize the stirring at first. It may arise as a question. Is this all there is? Why do I feel so far from something I can't name? Why does this life, with all its movement, feel somehow incomplete? These are not signs of despair. They are the first signs of waking. Before birth becomes a full identification with the world, there is a space of tension, a moment when the soul, wrapped in form, still carries a faint resonance of what came before. It cannot speak it, it cannot think it, but it feels it in the quiet places of being. This is why some are restless from the beginning, why even in childhood the world seems too small to contain what they sense within. It is not arrogance, it is not confusion. It is the soul remembering, without words, that it came from somewhere more vast than this. The world, however, will soon rise to meet the soul with noise, with identity, with history, with obligation and expectation. The senses will deepen, the body will grow, the story will unfold, and in time, that faint inner tension may be forgotten, covered by survival, by pleasure, by fear, by performance. This is the normal way, the way of sleep. Many sleep, though they think they are awake, says the Hermetica. They move through the world as if alive, but their soul is turned inward, curled like a child in the womb. This state is not condemned. It is part of the soul's journey through form. To awaken, one must first fall asleep. But even in sleep, the divine mind has not departed. It remains within as the silent guest, the watcher, the untouched center. The Hermetic calls this the mind of the heart, not emotional feeling, but the innermost awareness that is beyond thought. It is not accessed by argument. It is not reached by belief. It is remembered through stillness. Those who learn to listen, not with the ears but with the whole being, begin to hear it again, not as instruction but as presence, a clarity that does not speak in words. Before the soul fully enters the world, before it takes the veil to be the truth, this inner voice stirs one last time, a kind of knowing that has no image. It reminds the soul that it is not a body, that it does not belong to fear, that it is not made to conquer, to chase, to grasp, but to remember, to bring what it once knew into the world it now enters, not to escape the body, but to live in it without forgetting. This is the challenge, to be here but not lost, to be in time but not of it, to walk the world while carrying a light that does not burn or fade. The Hermetica says that few remember, but all carry the seed. That is the difference. Some will live as if they are only what they appear to be, but others will begin to listen, to feel, to remember. And that memory will not be like information. It will be like recognition, like waking from a dream and realizing you were never far from the truth, only distracted. The veil is now complete. The soul is within the body. Life will begin, experience will unfold, but the light within has gone out. It is hidden, and hidden things can be revealed. It is silent, and silence can be heard by those who have grown quiet enough to listen. Even in the forgetting, the divine never withdraws. The soul is never abandoned. It is only given the chance to discover what it already is, not by returning to the place it came from, but by realizing that the place it came from was never truly left. There comes a moment, subtle, quiet, when something stirs beneath the surface. It does not arrive with clarity. There are no visions, no voices from above. It does not shout. It barely speaks, but something within begins to shift. The soul, long dormant beneath layers of thought and sensation, begins to move. At first, it is only an unease, a faint tension between the surface of things and something underneath, a sense that life as it appears is not quite what it seems. The world still functions, the body still moves, but behind it all, a question begins to rise, not spoken aloud, not even fully formed, just the growing realization that something essential has been forgotten. This is the beginning of awakening. Not to new information, but to a truth already known. Not to another teaching, but to something that was always present, just obscured, like a faint outline returning as fog lifts from the land. The Hermetica describes this moment not as discovery, but as remembrance. The soul does not gain something new, it begins to recover what it lost, a kind of second birth, not into the world, but into itself. My son, you must die before you die. These words are not metaphor, they are instruction. For the soul to awaken, the old identity must begin to dissolve, not the body, but the image the soul it took itself to be. The accumulation of roles, fears, desires, names. The soul had mistaken the coat it wears for its essence, and now, for the first time, it begins to remove it. The process is not dramatic. It is inward, gentle, slow. It begins with noticing, with the realization that nothing external seems to satisfy, that pleasure is temporary, that status is empty, that even beauty, while real, cannot explain the ache that still lingers inside. That ache is not a flaw. It is not a sign of something missing. It is a call, a homing signal sent from the soul to itself. The Hermetica speaks of two minds, the mind of the body and the mind of the soul. The first is reactive. It thinks in fragments, tied to sensation and survival. It is not evil, but it is not whole. The second is nous, divine mind, planted in every soul like a hidden ember. Most never feel it, or if they do, they confuse it with imagination, dismiss it as daydream or doubt. But those who become still enough, quiet enough, begin to feel it rising, not as a thought, but as a presence, as a different kind of attention, something deeper, more stable, unconditioned. When you remove from yourself the senses and the distractions of the world, then will the vision of the divine mind rise within you. This is the first turning. The soul begins to look inward, not to analyze, but to remember. And what it finds there is not a new idea, but a reappearance. Something it has always known, but forgotten. There is no drama in this remembering, only simplicity, only clarity. The old self does not vanish in an instant. It resists, it clings. It has grown used to being the center. But with each moment of stillness, each turning away from outer distraction, the inner begins to brighten, like a room slowly filling with morning light. It is not escape, it is recognition. The soul begins to understand that it is not the body, though it lives through it, not its thoughts, though it witnesses them, not its fears, though it once obeyed them. It begins to see clearly for the first time, and in that seeing, the false begins to fall away, not with effort, but with ease. What is no longer mistaken for truth does not need to be fought, it simply fades. This is the death the Hermetica speaks of, not a physical ending, but a release, the death of illusion, of separation, of identification with what was never real. The soul in this moment is reborn, not made into something else, but restored to what it already was. The spark of divine mind, long buried, now glows steadily. Not a flash, not a surge, but a warm, enduring presence. It guides without words, directs without force. The soul begins to follow it, not outward, but deeper inward. Hermes tells his student that this is not the reward of the few, it is the right of all souls. All came from the same light, all carry the same seed. All men have mind, but not all have the mind that sees. For those who are ruled by the body see only with the body's eyes, but those who awaken see with the mind of the soul. This vision is not mystical. It is not supernatural. It is the return of direct perception. To see the world not through comparison but through presence, to know without needing proof, to stand within the moment and realize that the moment is enough. The soul no longer seeks to own or define. It begins to witness. This witnessing is not passive, it is alive. It is the highest form of participation, not control, but harmony. The soul begins to remember its source, not as a distant realm, but as the truth of its own being. It realizes the divine mind is not elsewhere, it is here, it is what I am. And yet, the world continues, the body continues, sensation does not end. But now they are seen as they are, real but not ultimate, valuable but not defining, beautiful but not permanent. The soul moves through life no longer as a seeker but as a rememberer. It does not reject the world, it sees through it. This is the second birth, not of form but of awareness. The Hermetica calls it the rebirth into truth, and once this rebirth begins, the soul is never the same. It may falter, it may forget again, but the center has shifted. The old self no longer holds dominion. The divine mind has begun to reign once more. This is not a place one arrives at. It is a state one returns to. The soul does not gain new powers, it rediscovers its native clarity. The veil lifts, not all at once, but enough to see through it. And in that seeing, peace begins to rise, not as a concept, but as a way of being. The soul is no longer fighting to become, it simply begins to be. The light once known in the beginning has found its way back to itself, not by travelling upward, but by going inward, by turning through the silence to the stillness behind all things. In the Hermetic rebirth, the soul is said to shed its mortal coverings, not the body but the false identities layered upon it: anger, vanity, envy, fear, pride, desire, restlessness. One by one they fall away, not by violence, but by no longer being needed. As these fall, something else rises: peace, stillness, compassion, vision, strength, joy, not acquired, but revealed. These are not new garments, they are the soul's original clothing. The light of the divine, no longer buried, begins to shine through. This is not the end, this is the beginning of presence. The soul reborn within the body begins to live, not as something trapped, but as something awakened. The world remains what it is, but now it is known from the inside. And what once felt like exile now feels like opportunity, not to escape but to embody, not to ascend but to bring light into the places that had forgotten. When the soul remembers what it is, the world itself begins to shift, not outwardly, not in appearance. The stars do not move differently, the streets still hum with noise, the faces around us remain the same, but something fundamental has changed, not in the world but in the way the world is seen. After awakening, the soul no longer searches for what it once believed was missing. It no longer grasps at meaning or clings to outcomes. It no longer fears the loss of what it never truly possessed. The fear that once sat beneath every thought begins to dissolve, not with resistance, but with recognition. And with this recognition comes peace. Not the peace of escape, not a withdrawal from life, but a peace that moves within it, quietly, steadily, as an unshaken center. This is the life the Hermetica describes as the fruit of awakening, a life lived in time, yet no longer bound by it. A body still rooted in earth, but animated by the divine. The one who has been reborn, Hermes says, is no longer led by the world, but sees through it. The eyes still open, but what they see is different. Not because the world has changed, but because perception has been restored. The soul now sees with what Hermes calls the mind's eye, the inner vision granted by the divine mind itself. This eye does not divide, it does not compare or judge, it sees what is, and in seeing truly, it no longer fears. The awakened soul no longer identifies with the form it wears. It lives in the body. It cares for it. But it no longer believes itself to be it. The body becomes what it always was: a vessel, a tool, an instrument for expression. The Hermetica does not reject the body. It simply refuses to confuse the temporary with the eternal. The body is to the soul what the flute is to the breath, a channel, a shape, a means through which the inner may become visible. When the soul lives in this awareness, action becomes different, no longer reactive, no longer driven by fear, desire, or image. Actions emerge from stillness. Choices are made from clarity. There is no longer confusion about what is real and what is passing. In this state, the soul becomes a mirror. It reflects the divine mind into the world without effort, not because it tries, but because it has become clear. When the mind is quiet and the heart is still, the light within shines without distortion. The Hermetica describes this person as a light in the darkness, not a prophet, not a master, not a figure of renown, but a human who has remembered, and through that remembering, become fully present. This presence is its own power. It changes nothing externally, but it transforms everything in experience. The awakened soul no longer demands from the world, it gives to it, not as a task, not as virtue, but as a natural extension of what it is. The child of God, says Hermes, acts not from will but from nature, not from need but from fullness. There is no more striving to become, no more struggle to prove. The soul, anchored in the divine, simply lives. In this condition, life continues. Sorrow may still come. Loss, illness, endings. These are not avoided, but they are no longer mistaken for the whole. The awakened soul feels these things. It does not resist them, but it sees through them. It knows that what it is cannot be touched by what passes. And so it lives with a gentleness that does not fear pain, with a strength that does not rely on defense. The world, once seen as hostile or indifferent, now becomes transparent. Its rhythms are not always kind, its outcomes are not always fair, but its essence is no longer foreign. All things seen rightly are part of the same unfolding. Even suffering becomes meaningful, not as punishment, but as something that softens, deepens, clears away what obstructs. The Hermetica teaches that the soul's task is not to escape the world, but to transform its relationship to it. Become as God while still on earth, Hermes says, not by rising above, but by seeing rightly. This does not mean arrogance, it means clarity. To live as the soul, to act from divine mind, is to walk through the world without being caught in its illusions. It is to love without clinging, to serve without seeking reward, to speak without manipulation, to be without needing to be seen. This way of life is not dramatic. It may not be noticed. It often appears quiet, even ordinary, but its presence is unmistakable. It brings with it a kind of warmth, a silence, a still gravity. Others feel it without knowing what it is. It is the echo of truth moving through form. When the soul lives in this remembrance, all things become sacred, not because they are labelled holy, but because they are seen as they are. A stone, a bird's cry, the touch of water, the breath between words. Each becomes luminous, not in appearance, but in being. The need to name or claim dissolves. The soul does not analyze, it beholds. In beholding, it participates, and in participating, it remembers its place within the whole. This is not detachment, it is deeper intimacy. The world is no longer something to overcome, it is something to dwell within, awake. The Hermetica describes this condition as the soul becoming a son of the One, not in blood, but in likeness. The awakened soul does not imitate the divine, it expresses it, not by striving, but by surrendering to what is already present. This is the essence of wisdom, not knowledge, but alignment, not accumulation, but simplification. The soul returns to what it is, and in doing so, reflects the source from which it came. The world continues, the body ages, the seasons pass, but the soul, once centered in truth, is not moved by these changes. It lives within them, but not for them. It sees endings, but knows they are not final. And because of this, it lives without fear. It does not seek immortality. It simply rests in the knowledge that it never truly began and cannot truly end. From this ground, the soul begins to radiate, not with light, but with stillness, not with doctrine, but with presence. It teaches nothing, but its life becomes a teaching, not by intent, but by nature. Its peace becomes an invitation, and those who meet it may not understand what they are encountering, only that something in them softens, settles, remembers. This is the flowering of the soul, not the peak of a path, but the blossoming of what was planted before birth. What was given in silence now speaks. What was hidden in darkness now glows. The soul, having descended, having forgotten, having remembered, now lives not as a seeker, but as one who carries the light that was always there. It needs no title, no system, no praise. Its joy is in being. Its strength is in clarity. Its freedom is in not needing anything from the world it now walks within. And because of this, it can finally love the world fully, not as something to possess, but as something to serve. To live in a body is to live in separation, or so it seems. The eyes see boundaries, the skin confirms division, every voice is different, every face distinct. The world appears full of others, full of people, each carrying their own weight, their own stories, their own worries and wants. The soul newly awakened within this experience begins to notice something strange. It still walks through the world, it still sees other forms, but it no longer believes everything it sees. It knows now that the surface is not the source, the body is not the self. Behind the voices, behind the gestures, behind every set of eyes, it senses something familiar, not identical, not merged, but connected, resonant, not because it wishes to believe it, but because it can no longer ignore it. The soul begins to realize that it is not alone. Not in the comforting way people often say it, not as reassurance in loneliness. It is deeper than that. It is the recognition that behind every person is the same spark, the same light it once forgot and now remembers, and that light, though veiled in different forms, is never truly separate. This doesn't mean everyone understands it. Most don't. Most are still asleep, moving through the world, unaware of what they carry inside. But the awakened soul does not need them to know it in order to see it. But the awakened soul does not need them to know in order to see it. Seeing becomes simpler. It becomes quieter. The soul stops trying to define people by their behavior, their history, their status, their opinions. It no longer rushes to place people in categories. Instead, it begins to see something more consistent, a kind of shared depth beneath all the temporary differences. The Hermetica teaches that all things were born from the same source. Every soul came from the divine mind, poured out like light through a prism. Each color may be different, each path unique, but the light itself is the same. When that becomes more than a concept, when it becomes something experienced, the way the soul relates to others begins to change. It no longer compares itself, it no longer competes, it no longer resents. These habits don't disappear overnight, but their weight weakens. The need to be right, to be seen, to be above, begins to lose its grip. There's no need to dominate what you already know to be a part of you. What takes its place is not sentiment. It isn't a soft feeling of universal love, it's a recognition, a clarity. The soul begins to see others the same way it now sees itself, as beings who have forgotten, who are still searching, and who are shaped by experiences they don't fully understand. This understanding becomes the root of compassion. The Hermetica never speaks of pity or moral duty. It doesn't command the soul to love. It shows instead that once soul sees clearly, love becomes natural. Not emotional attachment, not romantic idealism, but a quiet, steady care that arises from the recognition of shared truth. There's no drama in this. It doesn't always feel powerful. Often it feels simple, like patience, like calm, like the absence of judgment when the soul sees another lost in confusion, or caught in fear, or driven by pride. It doesn't respond with anger or superiority. It sees what's really happening. It remembers what it was like to forget. It may speak, it may remain silent, it may walk away, but it does not forget the shared origin. Even those who harm, who deceive, who reject what is good, Hermes teaches that these are souls still trapped in the deepest levels of forgetting. He does not excuse their actions, but he sees their condition. He describes them not as evil in essence, but as sick in perception. To remember the light does not mean to tolerate harm, but it means that even while setting boundaries, even while speaking truth, the awakened soul does not lose clarity. It does not fall into hatred. It does not dehumanize. What has been remembered in oneself must be honored in others, even when they cannot yet see it. This doesn't mean all relationships are easy. Awakening can bring a deep sense of solitude. It becomes harder to play along with the world's illusions. The games of ego and appearance lose their appeal. Many will not understand what the awakened soul sees, or why it no longer reacts as it once did. But the awakened soul does not isolate. It no longer needs to escape into solitude to feel peace. It does not withdraw from life to protect itself. Instead, it learns to live alongside others, not in agreement, not in uniformity, but in awareness. And when it finds another who remembers, even just a little, a kind of resonance begins to flow. Not an emotional intensity, but a quiet recognition. Words may not be needed. Explanation becomes less important. There is simply a sense of meeting someone who carries the same truth. This is the root of sacred friendship. It has nothing to do with shared interest or personality. It has everything to do with shared awareness. The Hermetic speaks of this as the true form of intimacy, not a blending of selves, but a mutual reflection of origin. When two souls both remember who they are, they don't merge. They mirror, and in that mirroring, something deepens. Even in the simplest connection between strangers, between teacher and student, between parent and child, when one soul is awake, it creates a space where truth can rise in the other, not by instruction but by presence. The Hermetic teachings remind us that the divine mind is in all beings, but not all beings are aware of it. Those who are awake carry a responsibility, not to persuade, not to correct, but to live clearly, to become a reference point for what it means to be whole. This presence becomes a form of guidance that does not teach with words, it teaches by being what it is. It becomes a kind of tuning fork, reminding others of something they may not yet be able to name. Not everyone will hear it, not everyone is ready, but the presence is real, and it leaves a trace. This is how change begins in others, not through argument, but through recognition. The awakened soul walks through the world with this awareness, not superior, not separate, not saintly, just clear. It knows that every person is carrying something sacred, that some have buried it deeply, that others are on the edge of remembering, and that all, in time, will come to know again what they were before they were born. Until then, the task is not to wake others, it is to remain awake oneself, to live gently, patiently, honestly, to speak when truth rises, to be silent when silence is needed, to offer what is needed, not what is wanted. In this way, the soul begins to serve, not in duty but in alignment, not out of obligation but because it cannot live otherwise. Relationships change. The need to be understood, to be praised, to be needed begins to dissolve. What remains is something simpler, a willingness to meet others as they are, a willingness to hold space without control. In this way, the soul becomes a companion to others, not a guide above them, not a mirror of their illusions, but a presence that reminds them, even without words, that they are more than they believe. This is what the Hermetic calls living as light within the world, not to shine for oneself, not to be seen, but to carry clarity where it is forgotten. Even in difficulty, even in conflict, the light remains. The soul does not win arguments, it doesn't seek them. It doesn't live to be right, it lives to be real. And in that reality, others may one day find their way back, not through force, but through resonance. When the soul begins to see clearly, no longer confused by illusion or driven by fear, its field of awareness expands. At first, the clarity begins inward, with the recognition of one's own divine origin. Then it turns toward others, seeing not strangers, but fellow beings shaped by the same light. Eventually, that clarity extends outward again, until the soul no longer sees the world around it as other. It begins to recognize something familiar in the rhythms of the earth, the quiet of the sky, the pulse of nature itself. This is not the sentimental idea of nature as comfort. It's not about green fields or pleasant walks. It's something deeper and older. Something the Hermetic calls the living body of God, The world is not simply a stage upon which life unfolds, it is life. It is a living intelligence ordered and infused with the same essence that gave rise to the soul. In the Hermetic view, nature is not separate from the divine. It is not secondary. It is the visible expression of the invisible. It speaks not with words, but with movement, cycles, and form. Every tree, every river, every mountain and star carries within it the same breath that stirred the divine mind in the beginning. The soul that remembers begins to see this, not as an idea, but as a quiet recognition. It looks at the sky and does not see just weather. It sees rhythm. It sees order. It sees intelligence that did not need to be named to be real. The Hermetica says that nature is born of light and life, the same elements that gave rise to the soul. Therefore, the soul and nature are not just connected, they are siblings. They emerged from the same source, and each reflects the other. When the soul was still in its pre-birth unity, it gazed upon the unfolding of creation and felt drawn to it. That longing, that desire to participate in form, was not misguided. It was a recognition. The soul saw in the natural world a mirror of its own beauty. Now, after the long descent and the slow work of remembering, that same soul returns to nature with new eyes. And this time, it does not gaze as a stranger, it sees the deeper meaning in the rhythm it once fell in love with. The sun rises and sets, and the soul sees more than light. It sees the cycle of awareness, how clarity comes, then fades, then returns. It watches the leaves fall in autumn and does not see death, but transformation. It sees the soil accept decay and give rise to growth. It watches the tides pull and release, and feels something in itself move in time with them. These aren't metaphors, they are experiences. Nature to the awakened soul becomes a language, not one that must be decoded, but one that must be received. The Hermetica teaches that nature is not chaotic. It is governed by principles that originate in the divine mind. What looks random or harsh from the surface reveals harmony when seen from within. The soul that sees with divine mind sees that nothing in nature is truly still. Nothing is without purpose. Even the smallest things carry the structure of order, the patterns of growth, rest, change, return. And through this vision, reverence arises. Not the worship of nature as God, but the honouring of nature as sacred. When the soul walks among the trees or looks up into the stars, it begins to feel something that it once felt before embodiment, a kind of vastness, a stillness, a reminder that the self is not a fixed point, but part of a living whole. This perception changes how the soul lives. It no longer tries to bend nature to its will, it begins to move with it. It eats with awareness of where its food comes from. It breathes more slowly. It begins to see the seasons not just as weather but as wisdom. The cold teaches rest, the spring teaches renewal, the long days teach expansion, the long nights teach return. Even the body, once seen as a shell or burden, becomes part of this pattern. The Hermetica reminds us that the body is not to be rejected. It is part of nature. It is made from the same elements, shaped by the same forces, subject to the same rhythms. To care for the body, then, is not vanity or fear. It is harmony. It is alignment. The body is not the soul, but it is the home through which the soul expresses itself in this world. And when the body ages, the soul does not panic. When the body weakens, it does not cling. It knows that just as the leaf falls to feed the roots, the body too will one day return to the earth. This is not tragic, it is part of the rhythm. And what came from the earth will return to it, gently, silently, without fear. To live in harmony with nature is not to abandon civilization, it's not to run to the wilderness, it's to see clearly, wherever you are, and everything around you, man-made or wild, is still part of the unfolding of one intelligence. A city is not outside of nature, a machine is not unnatural by itself. It is the intention, the awareness, the presence with which we build and use these things that determines whether we are in harmony or in conflict with the whole. The awakened soul does not reject the world, it sees it through the lens of divine mind. And when it sees distortion, it does not curse it. It does what it can to bring balance, not with force, but with alignment. Nature becomes a teacher. It teaches patience. Nothing in nature hurries, yet everything arrives. It teaches acceptance. The tree does not resist the wind, yet it stands. It teaches precision. The stars do not deviate, and the seasons do not forget their turn. The soul that watches with care begins to internalize these lessons. It no longer rushes. It no longer argues with reality. It learns to wait, to act only when movement is needed, to rest when the time for rest has come. The Hermetica calls this way of living the rhythm of the cosmos, not imposed from the outside, but felt from within. And so the awakened soul becomes part of this rhythm again, not as an observer, but as a participant. Life no longer feels like a path to somewhere else, it feels like a spiral, returning again and again to the same truth, each time deeper, quieter, more complete. There is a passage in the Hermetic writings that says, "He who knows nature knows God, for nature is God's body, and every movement within her is God's will." This is not meant to literalize the divine. It is meant to remind the soul that the truth it seeks is not hidden in abstraction. It is present in what is near, in what is constant, in what breathes and dies and lives again without asking why. The natural world becomes for the awakened soul not something to be used or conquered, but something to listen to. And in listening, the soul hears again the voice that shaped it before it was born. At a certain point, the soul stops asking where it's going. The momentum that once pushed it forward toward answers, experiences, or new insights begins to fade. It doesn't feel like giving up, it feels like arriving, not in a new place, but in a quieter relationship with what has always been here. The drive to become gives way to the realization that there is nothing left to become, not because the journey was wrong, but because its purpose has been fulfilled. The movement outward has served its function. The soul has seen the world, questioned its meaning, stripped away illusion, and touched something within itself that no longer shifts. Now everything turns inward, not in withdrawal, but in recognition. What the soul was searching for wasn't far away, it wasn't something hidden in a distant state of consciousness, it wasn't waiting in a future moment, it was closer than the search itself. All along, the divine mind had never left. The Hermetica speaks of the divine not as an object of belief or worship, but as the source of all awareness. The soul is not separate from it. It is shaped by it, formed within it, and held by it without interruption. The illusion of separation is not corrected by climbing upward, it is undone by looking inward with enough honesty to see what's always been underneath. This seeing doesn't come as a dramatic revelation. It comes quietly, often in silence. Not silence as absence, but silence as fullness, where the usual movements of thought fall still, and something deeper begins to speak without words. That something isn't foreign. It's not mysterious. It's familiar, like recognizing your own reflection after years of looking away. The mind begins to slow. The inner commentary that once narrated every moment loses its urgency. There's no longer a need to explain reality. No need to label everything. Awareness becomes less reactive, less busy. It begins to take the shape of the stillness it's rediscovered. There is a natural dropping away of questions that no longer feel necessary. The soul stops trying to solve itself. It stops asking why it is here, what it must do, how far it must go. These questions belonged to the earlier stages of forgetfulness. They arose when the soul believed it was incomplete. Now there's a deeper kind of knowing, that replaces the need for answers. What's left is presence, not presence as a practice or technique, presence as a condition that reveals itself when resistance falls away. It doesn't require effort. It requires no affirmation, no posture, no special state of mind. It's simply the awareness that you are, and that being is enough. The soul that lives from this state doesn't speak much about it, not out of secrecy, but because it no longer needs to express what has already become its natural way of seeing. Language becomes a tool, not a necessity. The deeper truths don't require discussion, they are felt in the quiet attention carried into everyday life. Hermes describes this stage not as transcendence but as return, not to a heavenly realm, but to a truth that was never lost, only ignored. He speaks of the divine mind as implanted within the soul, not hovering above it. It has always been there, waiting to be noticed. The inward resting does not mean withdrawal from the world. It's not an escape. It's not hiding. The soul still moves through the same relationships, environments and tasks, but it moves differently. It no longer seeks to control every outcome. It no longer reacts from fear or habit. There's a kind of steadiness that begins to guide each response. Less impulse, more clarity. The body, once viewed as a limitation, is no longer a point of conflict. The soul no longer treats it as something to transcend or improve. It simply lives in it without argument. It honors its needs without identifying with them. The body becomes a temporary vessel through which presence flows, not a problem to be solved. There's also a shift in how time is experienced. The future no longer feels like something urgent. The past no longer defines. The soul becomes rooted in the moment, not as an act of mindfulness, but because it sees that presence is the only place where truth reveals itself. The need to plan, predict, or revisit every memory loses its grip. Even spiritual practices begin to change. They may continue, or they may fall away, but the energy behind them shifts. They are no longer steps toward awakening. They become expressions of something already known. Meditation, prayer, silence, these become extensions of presence, not tools to attain it. There's a loosening of identity. Not only the surface self, but even the subtle idea of being awakened. That identity too becomes transparent. There's no longer any interest in holding a spiritual image or in being seen as someone who knows. The soul doesn't need to be someone. It's no longer confused about what matters. This doesn't mean it forgets how to live. The soul becomes more ordinary in the best sense. It lives without performance. It speaks without needing to impress. It helps when it can, and withdraws when it must. There's no role to play, no point to prove. It simply shows up. And when it does, something in the world responds. Not because the soul radiates power, but because it carries quiet. There's a stability in it that softens the space around it. People feel less pressure. Conversations feel less noisy. Even conflict feels less threatening. The soul doesn't try to fix others. It doesn't need them to change. But its presence becomes a kind of mirror. It reflects what is possible when the search ends. The Hermetica describes this final return as the soul no longer being a wanderer. The wandering wasn't about place. It was about identity. The soul wandered when it mistook itself for the things it saw and felt. Now the movement stops, not physically but inwardly. The soul comes to rest, not in theory, but in being. This rest is not passive. It's not static. It's engaged. But it's not agitated by outcomes. It listens carefully, speaks simply, and responds from clarity rather than habit. It no longer needs a reason to be what it is. It just is. The soul is not trying to be divine. It doesn't seek to purify itself. It recognizes that it was always formed in light. Even its moments of confusion and pain were part of a much larger unfolding. Nothing has been wasted. Everything was part of the return. There's a kind of trust that emerges, not trust in circumstances, but in the nature of reality itself. The soul doesn't need to know what comes next. It doesn't fear endings. It doesn't resist change. The sense of control that once felt necessary begins to dissolve, not because life becomes easier, but because the soul no longer sees itself as separate from the whole. What remains is a quiet willingness to live fully, without the need to hold on. The divine is not elsewhere. It's not waiting beyond death or hidden behind rituals. It is fully present, here and now, as the awareness that knows this very moment. And the soul no longer stands apart from it, trying to reach. It sees itself as it. This recognition is not intellectual. It cannot be explained to someone else, but it becomes the ground of how the soul moves through the world. It carries this knowing the way the body carries breath, not consciously at every moment, but always within. Even as thought arises, even as emotion stirs, the soul doesn't lose contact. It remains clear. It watches, it participates, and it lets go. There's no more urgency to awaken, no more chasing of insight, no more subtle pride in being further along. There is simply awareness, settled into itself, lived, not described, shared, not shown. There's no real conclusion to this journey. The soul doesn't arrive at a final truth that explains everything. It doesn't come to possess a single insight that resolves all mystery. Instead, it learns to live with mystery, to let it breathe, to let it be, without needing to resolve it into answers. This is the end of seeking, not because the questions have been answered, but because they've lost their urgency. What remains is presence, and within that presence, a kind of peace that isn't dramatic or even obvious. It doesn't silence the noise of the world or shield the soul from difficulty. It simply stays. It stays through movement, through emotion, through impermanence. It stays through beauty and through loss. It doesn't defend, it doesn't define, it just remains. This is the return, not a return to the divine as a place, not a return to some higher plane, but a return to this life, seen clearly. The same streets, the same body, the same people. But now, nothing is mistaken for more than it is, and nothing is dismissed as less than sacred. The soul, once burdened by the effort to become something, now lives without that burden. It doesn't have to explain its path. It doesn't need to compare or measure its clarity. There's no longing to be elsewhere, no imaginary future to reach. It has come home to itself in a way that allows it to live fully here, without losing anything essential. This isn't detachment. It's not withdrawal from life. It's a kind of intimacy that no longer needs to hold on. The soul walks through the world as it is, unfolding, imperfect, unpredictable, and meets it without flinching. It doesn't mean everything becomes easy. Life continues to move in cycles, birth and loss, gain and disappointment, warmth and cold. But the soul doesn't contract in the face of these movements. It doesn't build stories around them. It simply lets them pass through, understanding that they are part of the greater rhythm. And that rhythm is not random. It's not cruel. It is alive, shaped by the same intelligence that gave rise to the soul itself. The Hermeticus speaks of this as the Logos, the divine mind expressing itself through all things, not only as ideas or ideals, but as living form. This form includes the body, the seasons, the patterns of experience. All of it belongs. The soul no longer fights with what arises. It no longer treats the world as a test or a distraction. It no longer imagines that peace is found by escaping from form. It sees clearly now that the divine is here too, woven into the texture of what was once called ordinary. There is still motion. The soul makes choices, tends to responsibilities, feels pleasure and sorrow. But there is no more confusion about identity. The soul knows that what it is cannot be touched by outcomes. It knows that nothing gained can add to its essence, and nothing lost can diminish it. This clarity doesn't isolate the soul, it connects it more deeply. It allows a kind of love that isn't dependent on being loved in return, a love that doesn't need to be seen or acknowledged, a love that doesn't protect itself, because it no longer imagines that it can be threatened. Even service becomes different. The soul helps where it can, not from obligation or from a sense of personal virtue, but because its nature is aligned with the whole. Where there is suffering, it brings attention. Where there is confusion, it brings silence. Where there is beauty, it simply receives. The soul doesn't act from a role. It doesn't play the part of the awakened one. It has no interest in appearing spiritual. It no longer divides its life into sacred and mundane. Every part of life becomes integrated. Everything belongs. This includes death. The fear of death, once hidden beneath so many layers of thought and behavior, has dissolved. Not because the soul knows what happens next, but because it no longer clings to what it has. It doesn't deny the ending of the body, but it doesn't confuse the body for the whole. The soul sees death now as another return, a passage, not a punishment. It no longer imagines that life is something that can be held. It sees that everything it has ever loved was already passing, already returning, already flowing back into the source from which it came. And that source isn't far. It isn't hidden. It is the very presence in which this moment unfolds. The Hermetica reminds us that nothing truly ends. What dissolves becomes part of what gives rise again. This is not a promise of individual continuation. It's a deeper insight that life itself never stops, and that what we are is not a thing within life, but life expressing itself through form. The soul no longer asks what happens after death. It lives with the understanding that whatever comes next is made of the same intelligence, the same peace, the same rhythm that carried it here, and that is enough. It does not need to possess the future. It does not need to preserve the past. It rests in what is now, with a kind of reverence that doesn't need ceremony or belief. Even memory changes. The soul remembers not as a way to revisit, but as a way to soften. It looks back without attachment, without regret. It sees its past not as a story to hold on to, but as a sequence of moments that all pointed here, to this quiet presence, to this return. And while the soul no longer looks for instruction, it remains open. It continues to learn, not by reaching forward, but by receiving the unfolding of each day with humility. Wisdom becomes less about what is known, and more about how clearly one can remain present with whatever arises. There's an understanding now that no moment is separate from the divine. The familiar becomes sacred again, not by being changed, but by being truly seen. A single breath becomes a reminder. A shared glance becomes enough. Stillness, even when brief, reveals more than the mind ever could. When others ask for answers, the soul may not have many. It speaks simply. It doesn't try to persuade. It doesn't argue. It knows that everyone will remember in their own way, at their own time. Some will ask questions. Others will turn away. The soul does not try to interfere. It carries the light not as a message, but as a way of being. It walks through the world without explanation, but with a steadiness that touches others. It doesn't need recognition. It doesn't need to be understood. Its peace is not fragile. Its presence is not a performance. What has been remembered is not an idea. It is the condition behind all thought. It is the stillness beneath all movement. It is what was present before the body was formed, what will remain after the form dissolves, and what never left, even in the deepest forgetting. Now the soul walks gently, not because it is cautious, but because it no longer wants anything from the world. It is not avoiding. It is not resisting. It is not trying to escape. It is simply living, fully, honestly, with no need to hold or defend. This is the full return. not to a place, not to a higher state, not to an identity, but to life, just as it is. There is no final teaching, no final truth, no final sentence that explains the journey. What remains is presence. What remains is attention. What remains is a soul, whole again, living without a name for what it knows, but knowing it nonetheless. And that is enough. The journey is complete, not because there's nothing left to learn, but because the soul has stopped searching for what was never lost. Everything it chased, everything it feared or hoped for, has been absorbed back into a deeper awareness. What was once scattered is now whole. What was imagined to be outside is now known to be within. The divine wasn't waiting in a future state or a higher realm. It was already here, in the breath, in the moment, in the stillness behind every experience. The Hermetic never spoke of escape, it spoke of recognition. And now the soul recognizes that it was never separate. It didn't need to rise above the world, it only needed to see the world clearly. The same world remains. The same people, the same rhythms of time, the same uncertainties, but the soul no longer demands anything from them. It no longer imagines that peace will come from changing what is. Peace has already come, from remembering what always was. This light was never a destination. It was the condition of being itself. It shaped the journey and stayed through the forgetting. It didn't move, even when the soul turned away, and now, as the soul turns inward for the last time, it finds what was there from the start. Nothing needs to be explained. Nothing needs to be earned. The soul now lives without reaching. It acts without needing outcomes. It breathes without holding its breath for meaning. This is not detachment, it's intimacy without ownership. The world is still alive with movement, but the soul doesn't grasp at it. It walks gently because nothing is missing, and nothing must be held. Death no longer holds weight over the soul. It doesn't fear it, and it doesn't need to define it. Death becomes part of the same rhythm that shaped the stars and the seasons. It may end the form, but not the light. What matters now is not what comes after, but how fully the present is lived. The body returns to the earth, the soul returns to silence. Neither are losses, neither are endings. The pattern is complete, and it begins again, not with a name, not with a story, but with the same presence that now sees without distortion. There's no need to say more. The soul does not live to be understood. It no longer holds a message. It has become the message, quiet, rooted, unseen. And in this quiet, nothing more is asked. The soul is not elevated. It is not exalted. It simply is, resting in a truth that does not need to move to be real. The journey ends where it began, in presence, in clarity, in peace. And the light we never left continues forward, in silence, through every breath that follows.